Time for questions?
Mark.
Here, good to see you. Whereas I definitely don't, can you go back 2 slides? Forward one. So talking about the different rates, while I definitely don't disagree with you that it appears that Rogers and Merrill have at least their rates wrong, the significance that you attach to those rates have a lot to do with the size of the space in which you've coded the different characters. For example, if you were to be very pedantic about your symbolic coding, and say if the feather were up versus the feather down, and you had a whole bunch of them, then that's naturally going to lead to a large number of changes if they're all counted the same.
Yes.
So do you have some advice for those of us that do try to categorize these things into discrete states, how to go about weighing your categorization and then interpreting the different rates?
Yeah. No. Because I think that really is a pretty profound. There's no natural units in the way there is with kind of DNA. So you know, DNA a basis substitution. Well, you can model in different ways, but I think that really is a very hard problem in terms of comparing relative cultural rates. Like, you're right. How do you know, painting something red versus brown, or having it natural colour? How does that compare with building a canoe with 2 hulls versus 1 hull? Yeah, there might be some backwards ways of doing it where you scale things proportional to time, but that wouldn't then enable you to talk about the relative rates.
Yeah, I mean, if you had some sort of calibration.
Yeah. So I think this is, it's just another argument against the interpretation of what Deborah Rogers and co were kind of saying. And it doesn't impact on what I really want to say, which is that different aspects of culture might have different histories. And therefore our challenge is to kind of, just like different genes, we all know that different genes can have different histories. And a kind of, one of the famous kind of sayings in dialectology is that every word has its own history. So the task here is to estimate what those histories are and see how coherent or not coherent those different lineages are. So really that's the more substantive stuff I want to say. I was just throwing in some skepticism about their claims about relative rates, and we've added an excellent addition.
On the same point, so people like paleontologists that want to estimate evolutionary rates and don't have bases, typically when there's two metrics they use. There's the Darwin, which is as a percent of the characters, obviously has problems, and then I don't know what they call the other one, but it's as a percent. It's they scale by the standard deviation of the characters variation in the population, which is a more natural unit. And people like Cambridge and people who've assembled these big compendiums of rates. And it seems to me, and correct me if I'm wrong, but so if you had metrical characters on canoes, exactly how you have to think about how you do that with symbolic stuff. But it could be simultaneously true that the equivalent of stabilizing selection would mean that you get very low rates of evolution of the mean trait value for something like how tall the mast is, or how width to length ratio, or some strongly functionally constrained attribute of the canoe. And maybe those would be exactly the things that would be most likely to be borrowed across. So rates measured as the way you're measuring them, they would be very high rates of evolution, but in terms of thinking them the way a functional morphologist would think about them, very low rates of evolution, whereas it could be exactly the opposite for symbolic stuff, right? So symbolic stuff, it really matters that you paint your canoe correctly, but for who for being a member of this population, that doesn't matter much in terms of anything else. So
right. So it's really the kind of borrowability that's driving the kind of high rates, and that doesn't apply to land snails, but would apply to bacteria. So yeah, I think probably you might have people that are doing those kind of measures, I guess. So it'd be really interesting to, one of the things that hasn't been fleshed out is the kind of link between kind of microevolutionary studies in culture and these kind of macro evolutionary kind of things that I'm doing. And in evolutionary biology, there's coalescent theory, which brings those things together. We don't have the equivalent of coalescent theory for culture. And the kind of processes you point out are going to mean it's going to be pretty complex.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yes.
This is a much less technical question on the same point, but does the history of where you are with that artifact matter in terms of, so if you have something new come in, like these canoes, right, you would think that you might tweak the functional things much more in the beginning until you get to that stabilizing point, and then, so does it matter how new the technology is?
I'm trying to think of, I just don't know lots of studies that have looked at that. So the answer is I don't know. That sounds very plausible to me. But I'm trying to, we could study, study it in much more recent societies, like the impact of life or something like that. I don't know in these kind of traditional Polynesian societies that there's any kind of documentation of things like that.
In the analysis that you did of how important horizontal transmission is and basically messing up the ability to work phylogenies,
Yeah.
it seems to me that one of the reasons why this horizontal, so the conclusion that you draw from your simulations is user simulations.
Yes.
Yeah. That you need a lot of horizontal borrowing to mess up the signal of phylogeny, basically.
Yes.
Is the reason for that because essentially the accumulation of what you might think of as many traits of these languages are co-evolved, culturally co-evolved. We were talking about this earlier. I gather you have some new data that maybe calls into question how much functional co-evolution there is between different parts of life. But is that one of the reasons why? Would that enter into the simulation, or is it purely just that the signal of historical accumulation of everything overwhelms the horizontal transmission signal? Or is there something about
Language as a system.
the language as a system that makes it resistant to importation? Simulate that at all.
Right. So we've done both kinds of simulations. So these simulations, we just treated each lexical item as independent. So there was no functional differences there. We have done simulations where we had a high degree of dependence, but not with these borrowing ones. My kind of intuition is that apart from sort of reducing the sort of resolution, because you've essentially got much fewer degrees of freedom, it isn't going to substantially change the result. So I don't think it's anything particular to do with language as a system. I think it's, if you look, the local borrowing scenarios, when you think if you're doing local borrowing, you're not going to hugely destroy the overall kind of historical relations. You're going to mess them up a bit locally. So it isn't going to take the tree topology way across into another bit of tree space. It might mean that for any particular trait, the kind of history is more complex, but overall, that the relative kind of backbone of the topology is going to be estimated pretty reliably. So local borrowing can be locally messy, but still produce kind of basic structures that are pretty accurate. And so it's really only these kind of global borrowing scenarios or very high rates of local borrowing that substantially bias the estimates. We also did this for dates, and it turns out the dating is a little less robust. And as you can imagine, as you have increased borrowing, you make things more similar, therefore you tend to underestimate the dates.
Just to follow up, do we know empirically, is there empirical data on the likelihood of borrowing as a function of how much it would disrupt functional dependencies in the language?
No, but people, well, yes and no. People know that it's probably easier to borrow from languages that are structurally more similar, and there's been some good documentation of that. But I don't think it's been sort of formally quantified. So, yes, it's easier to borrow within Romance languages than, say, from Romance to some kind of unrelated kind of language group. Yeah. So that's why I think local borrowing, apart from the fact you're obviously likely to be physically closer, it's also going to be potentially easier.
So I think Charlie Dunn and his colleagues did a simulation of type 1, looking at type 1 error rates in contrast, and they found that, as I recall, the having more horizontal transfer did have a pretty big effect on the type 1 error rates. And so it's not just like you can recover the tree, but then you still could be misled in your evolutionary comparison from that. So I was wondering if you would comment on that.
So their focus was mainly on the kind of use of comparative tests like the independent contrast to make accurate kind of inferences. I had quite a lot of problems with Charlie's simulation. I think it was a good thing to do, but I think if you look at the meaning in the translate into kind of what it means in real cultural terms, the kind of parameters they use, although the parameter they use for kind of rate of borrowing looks quite low, actually when you change it into kind of generations, it turns out to be really, really very high. Yeah, I have a, so I'm, so two answers. One, he's kind of simulated different stuff. He hasn't looked at the ability to recover the trees or dates. Two, even with his tests of sort of functional dependencies with correlated evolution, he's used what I think is a very, very high rate of borrowing. So I'm a little skeptical. But I think there's a lot more work needs to be done using these things. Yeah.
Has any study been done on tracing the transmission of art and culture as this migration occurred and the evolution of those characteristics?
Depends what you regard as art. So obviously you could look at like barcloth culture in the Pacific, like tapa designs and things. But I'm trying to think of any formal analysis of art using phylogenetic methods, and the answer is I can't think of any. But I'd be curious, what would you predict? What would you think? Do you think there'd be some difference to the dynamic of transmission of artistic things to other aspects of culture?
Maybe.
What would the difference be? I'm kind of curious. I mean, I think it might be too, but I'm
I'm not sure.
just kind of wondering what's motivating the question in terms of
Mythological belief.
I'm very interested in gods, and so in the Pacific there's a range of different kinds of beliefs and mythologies about kind of gods and origin myths and things like that. I think that's a really kind of fascinating topic that can be studied quite a lot of detail. So one of the things I've been interested in is testing the idea of supernatural punishment. The idea that in order to maintain social cohesion in highly stratified societies, you need higher gods that can, moralizing higher gods that can kind of control and punish you in the afterlife. So I think that kind of thing really is amenable to being analysed using these kind of methods. I'll just do somebody else.
The linguistic method is operating off the assumption there's like a core set of terms that are relatively stable across time. And it also making the assumption that that core set of terms is more or less the same from one language to the other. Because obviously if they were very different core sets of terms from one to the other, it'd be a real problem. Which then raises the question of why is that the case in the first place? That is, what is the driving factor for what is it that makes certain core words relatively constant across a wide variety of languages, and what keeps them more or less constant through time within any language?
Yes. So there's some we have some answers to that question. There's some rather lovely work by Mark Pagel and Quentin Atkinson and Andrew Mead, where what they looked at was the frequency with which words are used today in four different corpora. I think one was English, one was Russian, one was Greek, and I can't remember what the other one was. So they looked at the frequency with which we say various words today. And then they looked at the stability of words estimated on an Indo-European language phylogeny. And what they found, and linguists had been kind of saying this before, but what they're able to kind of quantify, is that the words we use most often are the ones that are the most stable. So there was a very strong kind of relationship between the frequency with which words are used today and their stability estimated across the whole Indo-European family. And that applied kind of equally for those 4 different corpora which were sampled across the whole Indo-European language tree. And that's quite remarkable because what it says is that that tree, according to me, goes back about 8,500 years. So you've got lots of different, quite a vast amount of time of linguistic evolution. So there's been a kind of stability to the kind of patterns of relative rates of vocabulary. So they fitted a model where they just used frequency of word use and parts of speech, and that was able to explain 50% of the variation in rates of change of basic vocabulary. So that says that there really is a kind of uniformity and some regularity by which kind of basic vocabulary at least kind of changes, and that a major explanatory thing is frequency of use.
Of course, if I just follow up, that's an interesting idea because of the fact that with frequency of use, then you have more instances of correction of changes, that is to say, where somebody does introduce a change. You have more instances where somebody else is going to be in agreement, or several people in agreement that that's not a valid variation, whereas it's not used as frequently. There's more opportunity for something like that too.
So you could have a sort of stabilizing selection model with as much tighter stabilizing selection on frequent variance. And that might apply more generally to other aspects of culture, I don't know. Certainly ones that require kind of coordination, social coordination, that might apply. So I think an interesting question is, to sort of follow on from that, is language a special case? Are the differences about the kind of transmission mechanisms for language and the kind of degree of social coordination requires that means that it'll behave in quite different ways to the rest of culture? I don't think we know the answer to that particularly well.
If I could just follow up with that, kinship terminologies is another place, I'll be later, we can talk about it later. Kinship terminologies is another aspect because there you can pick up not only the linguistic part of it, but the structural part, and look at the question about the stability of structures over time.
Yes. Yeah.
Deducing to be very stable over time.
Yes, I've been involved. I'm involved a bit with some people looking at hunter-gatherer languages. They have a strong interest in kind of kinship terms. Yeah, for exactly these kind of things. It's also interesting to see what happens in contact situations. Yeah.
So, Jang Tehran has those Persian carpets, which are art form. Would you agree?
Yes, actually, I think that's a good choice. Yes, that's, I thought about that. I was just, so if you think that carpets are sort of an artistic representation, certainly the design of those carpets, you could think of as showing kind of artistic things. They, I mean, only has a limited number, like was it about 6 or something different kind of cultures, so.
It's very limited.
Yeah.
He has a lot of characters. I think it's only 6.
But it does seem like it might track to some extent at least the kind of population history.
So my actual question is, so there are these contact linguistic studies, Sally Thomas and like that, and they put forward, so there's examples like the formation tends to be a mile, because of computed vocabulary, and then lexicon questions, and then there's speech structural kind of situations like the Salish languages, Slavic languages of Southern Europe, and so on. So can you, I mean, it seems to me those are, I mean, they're smaller worlds, right? And maybe it's hard to measure contact, but it seems like they give you some kind of opportunity to test this kind of thing. Because, I mean, something produced Ma, and it's not, it was borrowed a word at a time or a grammatical device at a time. Something happened that was a kind of hybridization.
Yeah. I think I want to say just yes. Like obviously, seeing what happens in context situations is really interesting. I think, I mean, one of the tendencies, linguists love, like anthropologists really, weird and exceptional stuff.
Yeah.
And what you really want to know is what's typical, and you know how much variability is there. So I kind of wonder whether the kind of reports are biased to the really funky weird stuff, and not to the typical. So it'd be nice to see sort of quantitative estimates of the relative frequencies of different types of impacts in context situations. Yeah. Yeah.
So speaking about your exercise with the complexity, political complexity, can you actually use the same method? And I mean, I know that you had weights on the arrows, but I can actually visually tell which types of transitions are more likely, and can you use the method to kind of or test whether, like, given certain cultural packages or certain cultural states, certain types of changes are more likely to happen?
Yes.
And what is the state actually? So what is is the state to acephalous?
So we had big arguments about this figure,
Okay.
actually.
Do you like this stochastic search?
So I wanted all these little bits of stuff taken off it, but it does. See, the M values here are the kind of median rates, I think. So the lines are roughly proportional to those median rates. So yes, and you can test whether, like you might want to say, if we fit a model where these things are just forbidden, does that do any worse? Or if we fit a model where certain rates are really high and certain rates are forbidden, is that any worse or any kind of better? So yes, you can exactly test out different kind of transitions.
So is it the case that, for example, going from state to acephalous is more likely than going from state to simple chiefdom or to complex
So if we look
chiefdom?
there, the value is 0.56 there, and the value here is 0.68 there.
And the-
So we haven't done that test, but you could see,
Yeah.
whether, if we set those values to be the same, whether that's significantly
But
worse
that's
or not.
not the effective rate on the tree. That's the effective rate before you've looked at any data. So starting from the stationary distribution, that's the rate of changes.
Yes. Yeah. So I think we can do what you want to do, and it's sort of in a way it's what we've done. One of the reviewers. No, I won't go into that. It just gets fine. But yeah. That essentially, what you're asking is essentially what we've been doing.
Yeah,
Other questions? All right, thank you.